What even is Stellar Blade? I consider myself to be decently up to date when it comes to games. I know what's coming out, out of the closet, and I know what's good and bad. You really thought I was gonna say something? I watch announcements and awards, and when a video or article about a new game gets recommended to me, I'll take a look. You know, the article's definitely written by people who totally play video games and aren't just trying to farm as many clicks as possible, those ones. Regardless, my point is that while I'm not terminally online, combing the internet for hours to find the latest and most out-of-touch news on games, I consider myself to be pretty in the know. So it was a bit weird when I realized that Stellar Blade, a game that spawned enough internet rage to make The Last Jedi blush, was a game that I knew nothing about. Well, I knew something about it, and we'll get to talking about that in a fucking minute, but I mean about the game itself. What was it trying to be? What was the gameplay like? How about the story? Granted, I never actively searched for these things, and if you do go out of your way, you'll find plenty of pieces of media discussing those things exactly, but normally I find these things out anyway by just kind of existing on the internet. For most games, at least the ones with as much buzz around them as Stellar Blade, this has been true. But in this case, I guess most people are too preoccupied talking about Eve's jiggle physics and unrealistic beauty standards to focus on the whole-ass game that these things are attached to. Now, if you don't own Sony's Tower of Sin, this is not a game you'll likely be playing anytime soon, so you can just sit and listen to me ramble at your leisure. I know there's a certain amount of entertainment to be found in watching someone talk about a game that you've never played, but if you do own a PS5, you might want to listen. The reason these articles talking about meaningless nonsense annoys me isn't just because they're obviously not genuine, that's to be expected. What annoys me is that they shy away from talking about the actual game because, as it turns out, it's really fucking good. The most important element of any game isn't giant voluptuous personalities, despite what the internet might lead you to believe. It's the gameplay, which in Stellar Blade's case means combat. Stellar Blade? I didn't know she owned a sword. In terms of said combat, this is the best game ever made? Well, no. I have long held the opinion that Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice has the best combat system in gaming. And while I can't quite say Stellar Blade surpasses it, in my opinion it gets really damn close. I'll show plenty of why this is the case as the video goes on, but I will say this up front. Stellar Blade does not do anything that hasn't been done before. Every single part of this game, from the different aspects of the combat to the story, have been done before. Stellar Blade feels like if someone played Nier, Sekiro, and Metal Gear Rising and went, I want that, all at once. Stellar Blade gives you skill trees, allowing you to unlock different chain abilities, buff ability damage, and most importantly, perfect dodging and parrying. Perfect dodging is very Nier Automata-esque, even the animations are incredibly similar. Perfect parrying works very much like it does in Sekiro, as you might expect. Things like beta and burst abilities kind of remind me of Sekiro's Shinobi arts, and there are a lot of quick time events in this game which gave me the same feeling that the ones in Metal Gear Rising did. The rhythm of combat in this game is nigh perfect. Fast-paced, but you can always give yourself time to heal if you need to, and no input reading. Thank God, that shit is so fucking irritating. Much like the games it takes inspiration from, Stellar Blade's combat isn't really built for multiple enemy fights, but thanks to beta and burst attacks oftentimes having high amounts of AoE damage, I think it handles ganks better than its spiritual successors. And speaking of ganks, fuck 'em. Unless you count the goddamn wall of flesh guarding the hypercells, which occasionally drops crawly boys that are easy to kill and do barely damage. Anyway, all of the main bosses in the game are mano-a-mano, 1v1, straight up, you versus them, who is better fights, and holy shit, thank fuck. I was so nervous playing through the first time, like, I know there's gonna be a shitty gank fight that I'll get stuck on, I just know it, and it never came, just like your girlfriend. Speaking of bosses, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with enemies. The enemies in Stellar Blade are called Naytiba, which is apparently meant to be a riff off of the word native. Makes sense once you play the game. And they honestly grew on me over time. At first I was disappointed because I thought they looked pretty generic, but as I played more and more I started appreciating them more and more. There's a surprising variety of them too. Even though some are just variations, there's still quite a few different enemy types they can throw at you. They're usually pretty well spaced, so it's rare you'll have to deal with more than one substantial Naytiba at once. On the occasions where you do, the enemy types are generally pretty well balanced, though there is more than one occasion where I felt like I was being spammed. They also, as one might expect, have different methods of defeat, which encourages you to use all the tools that you have. Some enemies have shields, so you use the shield breaker beta skill pretty much exclusively on them. If there are a bunch of little guys around you, use the slash beta skill to hit them all at once. If there's a redditor, they'll run away from you. You're a woman. You get a gun eventually, which comes with different types of ammo, and certain enemies have a glowing yellow weak spot you can shoot for massive damage when they get stunned. It works a bit differently, but visually it kind of reminds me of the Acrid from Lost Planet. God, Lost Planet was fire. That game was my actual childhood in a The combat in the game is absolutely phenomenal. If I had to list it, I'd put it in the who needs sex when you have this tier, but it isn't perfect. If I had to make any gripes, I'd say that sometimes the recovery frames off of certain combos feel inconsistent. Sometimes you'll finish an attack and Eve will just fucking sit in an animation for no reason at all while you mash the parry button, when 30 seconds ago you were able to pull off the exact same chain and instantly parry without a hitch. It doesn't happen a lot, and I honestly can't be certain. Maybe there is a way to know if this will happen, but even if there is, then my critique would be that it isn't communicated clearly enough. Also, I experienced more than one instance where I attempted to use my charge, which you do by holding triangle, and it threw me into a goddamn combo and left me essentially wide open to get disemboweled by whatever flood-infected fuck I was supposed to be fighting. There are also different types of attacks which all have their own specific counters, much like perilous attacks in Sekiro. Attacks that glow yellow are essentially unparryable, meaning you have to perform a perfect dodge to avoid taking any damage. These are fine, I just find them to be annoying if an enemy or boss throws a whole bunch of them at you, but that might just be because I'm better at perfect parrying than I am at perfect dodging. There are also fatal attacks. There are two types of fatal attacks, both of which have unlockable counters in the skill tree. The enemy will glow a certain color, and when Eve's sword glows that same color, you dodge depending on which color it was. If the glow was blue, you dodge into the attack, which places you behind your opponent and gives you a free damage window. If the glow was pink, dodge backwards to kick off the enemy, which can be comboed into a charge. Both of these are pretty easy to do once you've experienced the attack once, but they are super satisfying to pull off. All of this is great, and there's plenty more to be found in the skill trees, but what honestly makes this game's combat so great to me is the animations. For a long time, I could never find anyone that did enemy attack animations as well as From Software. I don't know how they did it. They could be quick, slow, wild, or smooth, but they somehow always felt so intuitive, like the dodge timing made sense even if it was your first time. Despite everything Elden Ring did well, I was a little disappointed that they sacrificed this in favor of delayed tells, turning every boss into a memory game. Lies of P has a similar problem. I love that game to death, but bosses and even regular enemies hold their attacks like they're waiting for Chivalry of a Failed Knight Season 2 one day please, basically forcing you to memorize every moveset in the game if you don't want to take damage. This might be kind of a hot take to some people, but I consider this to be artificial difficulty, at least when it happens all the fucking time. This could just be my experience, maybe I just clicked with this game, but Stellar Blade doesn't really have this. Don't get me wrong, delay tells exist in this game, particularly towards the end, but broadly speaking, most of the moves I dealt with felt intuitive and well telegraphed. It probably helps that there are early upgrades in the skill tree that make perfect parrying and dodging easier. Now that we're through all of that, I can talk about the amazing bosses. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. Not just bosses connected by hallways you have to run through. Remember DS3. Is Stellar Blade a Souls-like? Although you don't lose currency when you die, the camps essentially act like bonfires. Resting at them refills your healing, which works basically like Estus, and the trade-off is respawning the Naytibas you might have killed. There's a linear path through the game with plenty of optional exploration to be done, and if you consider reading messages from dead people environmental storytelling, I guess it has that. The problem with this question is that the definition for what is and isn't a Souls-like is pretty murky. Stellar Blade has everything I just said, but according to Wikipedia, which is a great source, it got me through high school, Souls-likes are defined by high difficulty and dark fantasy settings. The high difficulty thing can mostly be dismissed outright since Jedi Fallen Order is listed as an example of a Souls-like, and it literally has a goddamn difficulty selection ranging from story mode to Grandmaster. And the dark fantasy thing too, that hardly applies to fucking Star Wars or The Surge, or even Lies of P isn't really what I would call dark fantasy. So by what loose definition I can find, Stellar Blade fits the bill in every aspect except That first thing I mentioned, you don't lose anything when you die. Souls-likes are generally defined as having some sort of punishment or setback for failure, even if you usually get a chance to undo it. Without this, can Stellar Blade really be called a Souls-like? Without sprinkles, a cake is still a cake after all. I honestly think it's best to let the rest of the internet handle this one. Giving the game the moniker of Souls-like doesn't do it any harm or favors anyway. What does matter is that this game does indeed take inspiration from Dark Souls, if only a little. I mentioned the whole linear path, non-linear world thing already, but there are even a few shortcuts sprinkled here and there, and when I discovered them, I was pleasantly surprised. They can be useful, as there are actually reasons to go back to previous areas if you're a completionist. I find the levels of this game to be very enjoyable. A lot of the aesthetics in the first half remind me of Nier, as does the story. More on that later. I don't know, when I see a decrepit and overgrown city and a small contingent of survivors and I'm playing as a badass female with a big, sword, I can't help but be reminded of the star of everyone's favorite Blender animations. I'm sorry, I can't ignore the facts, and the fact is that 2B is the Tom Hanks of Rule 34, if you will. Stellar Blade's levels contain plenty of loot, such as crafting materials, items to make permanent upgrades to weapon damage, tumbler usage and gear slots, and gold. Lots of this stuff is in chests, and while it's a small detail, I love that the dev team came up with a bunch of different little mini games to open these. These are my favorite, by the way. I lock the fuck in when I see this. They have plenty, so different puzzles keep getting introduced throughout the game, which is nice. Now that I mention it, this game is introducing stuff to you for a while. For instance, you fight Taki, your companion in the opening, I'd say about 40% of the way into the game, time-wise. Almost halfway through the game, and beating her unlocks Taki mode, where Eve gets to go Super Saiyan on people. And it comes with a whole ass skill tree. Yeah, pretty much halfway into the game, and they're still giving you entire skill trees to work on. Honestly, this is a huge boon for the game since there are so many mechanics that if they tried to teach you everything at once, you'd be overwhelmed with information. You would be bukkakied with mechanics. You get a gun in the form of your drone, and the game really goes the extra mile to get you used to using it by taking away both your sword and your drone scan, i.e. the ability to protect yourself and your ability to see what's lurking ahead of you and putting you in a bunch of narrow corridors for a while. Welcome to Stellar Blade, we have Dead Space. Hell, in the third to last boss fight in the game, it introduces a wipe mechanic requiring the use of your slugs to deal with. Segue. Bosses. The bosses in this game are, politely, absolute goblins, and there are plenty of them to be had. Some are grotesque Naytibas like Abaddon, Gigas, and Democrawler, and some are other members of airborne squads. And while I won't show you it here because you should play the game if you haven't, the final boss is a goddamn biblically accurate angel. Their designs are dope too if you haven't noticed. Taki is probably my favorite boss in the game for her design alone. Look at her, she's so fucking cool. She's also pretty hard. I honestly shocked myself on my first playthrough when I beat her on my second try. Though the bosses only get harder, particularly the last two fights were the ones that shaved the most deaths off me. Also, this game has music. And it slaps harder than Will Smith. What is it with these games and just having like the greatest soundtracks known to man? I don't get it. Last thing to touch on is the story. I'm not going to get into detail here because like I said, you might want to play this game, but overall, the story I felt was solid. Eve is likable enough as a protagonist, and both Lily and Adam are decent companions to riff off of, though I personally found Lily to be annoying in large doses. The basic setup is very Nier Automata, and at the beginning it appears to be virtually the same, just with Naytibas instead of automata. All the broad strokes you learn about in the first chunk of the game are ripped straight out of Nier, but the story does have its own thing going and its own twists here and there. And for what it's worth, the story overall is entertaining and solid. The different people you can meet can be interesting, and while it's not groundbreaking by any means, I think the story serves the game pretty well. There's even different endings you can get, which is always nice for replayability. Stellar Blade is a classic example of people missing the forest for the trees, or in this case, missing the intense and stellar gameplay for Eve's dump truck of an ass. And look, I get it. It's oh so very clickable to talk about why Eve is too sexy, or how Stellar Blade is censoring itself. This might be an unpopular opinion, but who gives a fuck? Whatever the developers want to do is goddamn fine, and frankly, if they were trying to censor this game, they didn't do a very good job. Like, seriously, what the fuck is this? This is not like what? Where is the censoring? Also, this is my favorite outfit. I don't know why, maybe I'm just weird. And as far as complaining that Eve's assets are too much, man, have you played Metal Gear Rising? Raiden is packing some fucking heat. Regardless, it's all smoke that can all too easily obscure a fantastic game. I can give it the good old one of my favorite games of all time seals. It might make its way into my top 10, who knows? Just remember, behind every bakery, within every set of jiggle physics, behind every internet rage jerk-off fest about a video game, there is an actual game to be played. And in this case, it's a damn good one. Thank you for watching.